Wren paused in front of her shelf. "Screw this," she said, marching across the floor, creaky floorboards and all. She stood by the upturned bed for a few seconds before banging hard on the door 1, 2, 3 times. Then she waited. And waited. There were no charging feet, no volley of battering fists and hands. There was nothing. Wren stood there a full minute just listening, but did not hear anything that suggested there was someone in the house other than herself. She struck the door with her palm 3 more times and waited another minute. She was greeted only by silence. She let out a deep sigh before beginning to drag the bed away from the door. She moved it back close to its usual position and went to stand back at the door. She levered the handle down and pulled the door inwards. The landing was clear. She stepped out of the room, leaving the door ajar. She tiptoed across the landing, peeking through each open door as she went. She looked down the 13 carpeted stairs. This was the house she'd grown up in. And now she would always remember it as the house her family had died in. She began to move, taking a firm hold of the banister as she went, 1 foot after another. She descended the stairs, then she came to a sudden stop as the 7th step let out a creak that sliced through the silence like a scythe. Wren stayed there frozen as the seconds dragged into a minute. But nothing came out of the shadows to meet her. She continued her journey down till she hit the solid surface of the hall floor. Wren looked right to the small entrance hall and back door, then turned left. She stepped into the large kitchen diner. The front door was still wide open. The family had been loading the car when it happened, when their world had come to a sudden end. She hoped they were all gone now. She closed the front door and turned the key in the lock, placing her back firmly against it and letting out a sigh of relief. A scream pierced the distant air, and Wren didn't feel quite so relieved anymore. She headed back out of the kitchen and down the long hallway to the living room. She was about to open the door when a hollow thud from inside turned her blood to ice. She ran back into the kitchen and opened a drawer, pulling out a long carving knife. There was nobody left to protect her. She had seen what had happened to her mother and father. She would never forget those images, ever. Now, whatever was waiting for her in the living room was something she would have to face by herself. More than face, though. She would have to deal with it. If it was one of those creatures, if it was a reanimated corpse, no matter whose face it wore, it was no longer human. She would have to learn that, otherwise risk turning into one herself. She stepped back out into the hallway as something clattered on the floor in the living room. Wren held the handle of the knife in both hands, pointing it towards the door as if trying to ward off whatever evil lay behind it. Another thud came from inside, and she could feel her heart beating faster, and her legs began to quake with fear as she placed her fingers on the door handle. She would have to act fast. She had seen how quickly those things moved. A memory flashed across her vision. She and her sister Robin, sneaking downstairs when she was just 11 to watch a late-night horror movie. It was a black-and-white zombie film from the 60s, and it was scary as hell. What Wren wouldn't give to face those clumsy, slow-moving, living dead things now, rather than these monsters. She held her breath. 1, 2, 3, before bursting through the door. The afternoon sun almost blinded her as she stormed into the living room from the dark hallway. A figure stood in the bay window, silhouetted against the backdrop of the white lace curtains. No time to think. Charge! Wren ran toward it, letting out a banshee-like howl, but the figure remained still until it put its hands up in front of itself defensively. "Wren!" it shouted, dropping a large wrought iron candlestick holder on the floor. Wren stopped in her tracks, letting her eyes focus. The adrenaline was still pumping and her heart was pounding, but she managed to reel in her primal instincts. "Robin?"